There is a persistent, comforting lie sold to us from the time we are children, that patience and kindness will eventually conquer cruelty. We are told to take the high road, to turn the other cheek, to defeat darkness with the power of love. But when you are trapped in a metal box hurtling down a frozen highway with a man who actively delights in your misery, the high road starts to look like a dead end. Sometimes the only currency a bully truly respects isn't love or patience or understanding. It is sheer, unadulterated terror. And it only takes a fraction of a second, an idling engine, and a perfectly timed scream to cash that check. The Canadian oil patch in the early 2000s was a brutal, unforgiving frontier. It was a place where frostbite was a daily occupational hazard, and the scent of crude oil clung to the inside of your nostrils long after your shift ended. I was 18, armed with a baby face, zero higher education, and a desperate need for cash. The job was well testing. For $20 an hour, a king's ransom when the minimum wage was a pathetic 5-something, I spent my days hooking up closed pressure tanks and flare stacks to freshly drilled gas wells. It was backbreaking, knuckle-busting labor out in the biting cold, wrenching iron that weighed more than I did. Once the physical setup was complete, the rest of the 12-hour shift consisted of recording gauges and inputting data for the oil barons back in the city. It should have been a dream first job. Instead, it was a waking nightmare entirely thanks to my assigned supervisor. His name was Royston. He was a man in his mid-50s whose physical form seemed held together entirely by spite, cheap tobacco, and an ocean of gin. He was aggressively overweight, moving with the sluggish reluctance of a man who resented gravity. On a two-man crew, the labor was supposed to be divided. Royston treated this mandate as a mild suggestion. He only lifted a finger when a 250-pound pipe required a second pair of hands to prevent me from being crushed. The rest of his day was spent entombed in the heated trailer, watching bootleg DVDs, napping in an office chair, and occasionally pecking at a computer keyboard with a single sausage-like finger. But laziness wasn't Royston's defining trait. It was his mouth. He possessed a mean-spirited, relentless streak that he disguised as humor. Because I was young, lacked confidence, and didn't possess the grizzled exterior of a seasoned roughneck, I became his favorite target. Every minor mistake was an invitation for character assassination. One afternoon, struggling with a heavy-duty power drill I had never been taught to operate, the bit slipped, grazing the metal casing. Royston sneered from the doorway of the trailer. He asked, with a venomous smirk, if my father had ever bothered to teach me how to be a man. I made the naive, fatal error of showing vulnerability. I quietly admitted that my dad had only been in my life for a handful of years. Royston's eyes lit up. He had found the raw nerve. The very next day, when a gauge reading was slightly delayed, he chuckled and muttered that it was no wonder my old man had walked out on me. When I finally snapped back, my voice trembling with suppressed rage, he deployed the universal defense mechanism of the chronic abuser. He told me I was too sensitive, too soft, and couldn't take a joke. Because the wells were located deep in the rural backcountry, our shifts required massive amounts of driving, sometimes up to 350 kilometers a day. Royston owned the work truck, a heavy-duty pickup that smelled permanently of stale alcohol and wet dog. The company paid him over $1 per kilometer for the use of his vehicle. But Royston, bloated and chronically hungover from his nightly conquests at whatever small-town dive bar we were forced to eat at, refused to drive. Every single morning he would toss me the keys, recline the passenger seat, and instantly fall into a comatose sleep. I acted as his unpaid chauffeur, navigating treacherous ice-slicked highways in the pitch black of early morning, earning a meager minimum wage for travel time while he racked up hundreds of dollars in mileage pay while unconscious. The breaking point arrived 3 months into this purgatory. We were sitting in a dimly lit diner that smelled of fried onions and despair. Royston was 3 drinks deep, his face flushed a mottled purple. The exhaustion had seeped into my bones, and the injustice of our travel arrangement had finally worn down my filter. Staring at my lukewarm coffee, I calmly suggested that since I was doing all the driving while he slept, perhaps he could kick a few dollars of that lucrative mileage pay my way. The suggestion that he part with a single cent of his unearned wealth shattered whatever fragile truce existed between us. Royston came unglued. He leaned across the sticky laminate table, spittle flying from his lips, and unleashed a torrent of vicious, personal abuse. He threatened my job, promising to have me blacklisted from every rig in the province. He dug into my intelligence, my upbringing, my worth as a human being. I was 18, exhausted, and cornered. To my profound humiliation, the sheer force of his hostility reduced me to angry, silent tears. I stared out the diner window into the black, freezing night. The instinct for self-preservation, which had kept my head down for 3 months, evaporated. It was replaced by a cold, crystalline clarity. I didn't just want a different crew anymore. I wanted to break him. Serendipity delivered the weapon the very next morning. We were 30 kilometers from the drilling site. The sun hadn't even considered rising yet. The sky was the color of bruised iron. Inside the cab, Royston was dead to the world, snoring with a wet, rattling intensity, his chin resting on his chest. As I navigated a desolate stretch of two-lane highway, the headlights caught a massive silhouette parked on a gravel pullout ahead. It was a semi-truck, a gorgeous, towering Peterbilt, its diesel engine rumbling like a captive beast. And standing right outside the driver's side door, kicking a tire, was the trucker. A terrible, beautiful idea bloomed in my mind. Royston was a heavy sleeper. He required a physical shake and shouted instructions to rouse him from his gin-soaked slumbers. So when I pulled the pickup onto the shoulder and eased to a stop a few dozen yards from the semi, he didn't even twitch. I quietly slipped the truck into park, eased the door open, and jogged over to the trucker in the freezing air. The trucker was a massive guy in a plaid jacket, chewing on a toothpick. I quickly explained my situation, painting a brief but vivid picture of the monster asleep in my passenger seat. I didn't ask for violence. I just asked for a favor. The trucker's eyes crinkled in the dark. He gave a slow, wicked nod, climbed back up into the cab of his Peterbilt, and waited for my signal. I jogged back to the pickup, slipped behind the wheel, and shifted into gear. Royston let out a soft snort, shifted his weight, and continued sleeping. I steered the pickup back onto the pavement, angling it perfectly. I drove right up to the front of the semi-truck, stopping nose to nose. We were less than 10 feet apart, staring down the massive chrome grille of the Peterbilt. I flashed my high beams. The trucker answered immediately, flooding our cab with the blinding, apocalyptic glare of his headlights. Then he reached for the lanyard above his head. The airhorn didn't just make a sound, it was a physical force. It ripped through the silent winter morning like the trumpet of doom. It was deafening, a wall of pure mechanical aggression vibrating through the windshield. At the exact same millisecond, I slammed the heel of my hand onto the horn of our pickup, adding a high-pitched, panicked blare to the symphony of terror. And then I screamed. I didn't just yell. I unleashed a primal, blood-curdling shriek from the very bottom of my lungs, thrashing violently in the driver's seat. "Oh my God, we're gonna die. We're gonna die." Royston went from a state of deep, alcoholic hibernation to absolute primal panic in a nanosecond. He didn't just wake up, he launched himself upward. The top of his skull collided with the ceiling of the cab with a sickening thud, leaving a permanent dent in the upholstery. His eyes, wide as dinner plates and completely bloodshot, snapped open to see the blinding headlights of a semi-truck bearing down on him. The deafening roar of the airhorn convincing his groggy brain that we were milliseconds away from being crushed into a cube of twisted metal. He shrieked, a high, reedy sound that belonged to a terrified child. He threw his arms up in front of his face, bracing for an impact that was never going to come. But the real consequence was biological. The sudden, violent surge of adrenaline, combined with the sheer terror of impending death, resulted in a catastrophic failure of Royston's internal plumbing. A profound, undeniable stench rapidly filled the heated cab. He had forcefully and completely soiled his pants. The trucker laid off the horn. I stopped screaming. The silence that rushed back into the cab was heavy, thick, and utterly suffocating. Royston lowered his arms. His chest was heaving uncontrollably. The realization of what had just happened, that we were stationary, that the semi was parked, and that he was sitting in his own mess, washed over his face in a tide of violent crimson. His jaw worked silently for a moment, trying to form words, but all that came out was a strangled, wheezing gasp. He looked like a man trying to swallow a live grenade. I threw the truck into reverse, backed away from the semi, gave the trucker a crisp salute out the window, and peeled out onto the highway. We made it about 10 meters down the road before Royston found his voice. It wasn't his usual booming, authoritative bark. It was a breathless, panicked squeak. He clutched his left arm, his face turning an alarming shade of plum. I have dangerously high blood pressure," he choked out, gasping for air. You could have killed me. I could have had a stroke." Looking back now, with the medical knowledge I acquired years later, he wasn't wrong. I had practically jump-started his heart with a car battery. But at 18, fueled by months of resentment and the intoxicating rush of vengeance, I had zero concept of a stroke. I just thought he was being overly dramatic, perhaps faking a medical emergency to avoid dealing with the humiliation radiating from his trousers. I looked at him, clutching his chest, marinating in his own filth, and a sound clawed its way up my throat. It started as a snicker, then bubbled into a chuckle, and finally erupted into a full-blown, hysterical, hyena-like laugh. I couldn't breathe. I was laughing so hard my vision blurred. "Calm down," I gasped, wiping a tear of pure joy from my eye. I looked right into his terrified, furious face and delivered the killing blow. "Can't you take a joke?" He tried to scream death threats at me, but every time he opened his mouth, he was interrupted by his own wheezing and my uncontrollable laughter. The angrier he got, the funnier it became. I fed on his rage. It was a 20-minute drive to the drilling site, and the entire journey was a masterclass in psychological torture. He sat rigidly in his seat, terrified of stroking out, furious beyond words, and completely unable to shift his weight without reminding himself of his accident. When we finally pulled up to the flare stack, Royston didn't even wait for the truck to come to a complete stop. He hauled his mass out of the door, moving with a stiff, awkward waddle, his face locked in a rictus of pure hatred. He pointed a trembling finger at me. "You're fired. Get your gear out of my truck." He stomped off toward the heated trailer, presumably to find a change of clothes and call the company owner to demand my arrest for attempted murder. I grabbed my duffel bag, kicked the truck door shut, and walked over to an overturned, rusted oil barrel. I sat down, pulled out a cigarette, and lit it. The freezing wind bit at my cheeks, but I didn't care. I sat there for 4 hours, smoking and enjoying intermittent chuckles as I replayed the glorious denting of the ceiling in my mind. It was a Pyrrhic victory, sure. I had lost my job, but the spiritual healing was profound. Eventually, a clean silver SUV crunched onto the gravel site. It was Callahan, the general manager and owner of the company. He stepped out, looking weary, his breath pluming in the cold air. Royston had indeed called him, spinning a wild, unhinged tale that painted me as a homicidal maniac who had tried to drive them both into oncoming traffic. Callahan motioned for me to get into the passenger seat of his SUV. As we drove the long miles back to the city, the heater blasting, he asked me for my side of the story. I didn't leave anything out. I told him about the verbal abuse, the stolen mileage money, the insults about my father. And then, in excruciating detail, I walked him through the setup with the semi-truck, the airhorn, the dent in the ceiling, and the biological aftermath. Callahan stared straight ahead at the road for a long time. His shoulders started to shake. He raised a hand to cover his mouth, but he couldn't hold it back. The general manager of the company burst into deep, booming laughter, slamming his palm against the steering wheel. He laughed until he had to wipe his eyes. "All right," Callahan finally said, catching his breath. "You can't work with him anymore, obviously." He didn't fire me. He was a decent man who knew exactly what kind of lazy liability Royston was. By the end of the drive, I was reassigned to a different 4-man crew on a totally different site. I got to be the lone sociopath, but I also became a minor legend. Word travels fast in the oil patch. By the time I walked into the new break room, the boys already knew what I had done. I had earned my street cred, and no one, for the rest of my time at that company, ever asked me if I could take a joke. There is a strange, delicate balance to the universe. Sometimes the scales of justice aren't balanced by karma or the HR department or even a higher power. Sometimes they are balanced by a teenager with nothing to lose and a trucker willing to lend a hand. If you take anything away from this story, let it be this. Never push a quiet person into a corner, and never sleep in the passenger seat if you've been making the driver's life a living hell. If you enjoyed this story of petty, perfectly executed revenge, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications. Leave a comment below telling me about the worst coworker you've ever had to deal with and what you did to survive them. Until next time, keep your eyes on the road.